I don't know about you, but I feel like I've spent the past 4 weeks living in the United States. You think it's already terrible, and every day they come up with something even worse. When you live outside the US like me, some people will try to dismiss the Black Lives Matter uprising by arguing that it's an American problem and that this shouldn't concern us any more than any other issues in the world. But what about that? Well, sorry buddy, but this time you don't get to use that card, because the conversation about racism that is starting now is something that needs to be had in every country of the planet. Generally, the rule of thumb is if you, as a country, stumbled upon land that did not belong to you, invaded it, pillaged it, exterminated the natives, and subsequently enslaved millions of people in order to exploit the resources of the said land, there is a very high chance that today you are currently dealing with a teeny-weeny little problem of racial inequality in your modern society. So far, we really can't figure out the connection. We've put our best scientists on it. Have you ever wondered what racism looked like in your favorite destination? Are you frustrated that because of Corona you can't travel and experience racial abuse in a foreign language? Well, let me give you a quick review of where we're at in the conversation about racism in the countries that I've experienced. Part 1. The United Kingdom. The United Kingdom. Everything seems so much more peaceful. We didn't have millions of slaves working in the British countryside a few generations ago. We don't think that our race is our main identity. We don't have a Confederate flag here. The UK is not like the States. We don't walk around with guns, and we can have a loud argument in the streets without fear of anyone pulling out a gun and shooting us. The police don't shoot people on a daily basis because the suspect lifted an eyebrow and they thought that they might have a gun. Besides, the British police are notorious for being friendly and harmless, right? So clearly the UK cannot be racist.
Well.
How can I put this without sounding boring? Let's be boring, but with some nice music in the background. In the UK, more than half the youth in prisons are ethnic minorities. Black people are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. Black people are detained under the Mental Health Act 4 times more often than white people. 1/5 of police officers were found to have an ethnicity bias strong enough to impact their behavior. 12% of the police using force involved black people, despite black people making up 3.3% of the population. Black people are stopped and searched for drugs at 6.3 times the rate of white people, despite the fact that drug use is lower among black people than white people in the UK. Black people are arrested for a drug offense at 6 times the rate of white people. Black people are 4 times more likely to get a criminal record for drugs. They're 4 times more likely to be taken to court and 5 times more likely to be fined or imprisoned for drug offenses. Not because they do more drugs, they don't, but because of the way they are policed and racially profiled. Only 20% of black people in the UK are homeowners compared to 68% of white people. Unemployment among black people is nearly double that of white Britons. At university, only 57% of black students receive a first or upper second class degree compared to 81% of white students. What probably doesn't help black students is that out of the 21,000 academic staff in UK universities, only 140 identify as black. That's 0.7% of your teachers and researchers who are black. And worse yet, in 2018, UK universities employed just 25 black women as professors. Oh, and did you know about the Windrush scandal, whereby the British government begged black people from the Caribbean to come help rebuild the country after Second World War and guaranteed them citizenship, only to, 60 years later, treat them as illegal immigrants. So people who had spent their lives in the UK were wrongly thrown into immigration detention centres and sometimes deported out of the country, and that up until February this year. Oh, but the Windrush generation could easily prove that they were here legally. All they had to do was to produce a document that was never handed to them, and that the British government had been keeping up until they decided to destroy it. In 2009, 2 years before they made that piece of paper mandatory in order to prove how long you had lived in the country. Yup. Oh, and did you know that up until 2015, the British taxpayers were still paying compensation to the estates or descendants of the slave owners for the loss incurred by the liberation of their slaves, and that some of the grandsons of those slave owners are currently sitting in the House of Lords, one of the institutions making the laws in this country? How could that possibly lead to systemic racism? Dunno. So how can there be so much systemic racism in the UK without anyone noticing? Well, black people have been noticing.
Guys, I'm not kidding. I had the weirdest fucking dream, right? You're not even going to believe this. I had a dream that the UK actually was racist and that I'd experienced a long series of racist microaggressions throughout my entire life, including overt forms of racism, like having stones thrown at me and being called the N-word, right? And that all of my black friends had also experienced similar forms of racism, and my friends who are people of colour, right? And that across the country, they'd erected these statues to races, but sort of like excluded the fact that they'd been really racist and like owned slaves and stuff, and sort of just praised them and hadn't really taught any of that kind of stuff in history books, right? It was so fucking crazy that this country had this collective delusion that it like wasn't real and stuff, but like it really, really was. But I've woken up and Boris has fucking said it's not true. Jesus. Thank fuck for that, because I was getting worried.
Half of black Britons say police have not treated them with respect. Britons are twice as likely to say police are institutionally racist. Black Britons say that black people are underrepresented on TV and films, will have less opportunity to succeed professionally. Black Britons think the governing Conservative Party is institutionally racist. I mean, just look at the reactions when the Tory party, the Conservatives, posted a picture for Father's Day featuring a black dad and his son. People went mad in the comments.
Is there a white father and son available, or do we not count in your New World Order? Take it down! Is it Happy Father's Day to black men only?
And now we exclude white people.
Virtue signalling gone mad. All lives matter. I'm confused. If that was the case, what happened to white dads, Asian dads, gay dads? List goes on.
Destroy the family unit.
Isn't that fascinating how white racists consider whiteness to be universal? They assume that only white people can represent the whole of mankind. The minute you represent another group, they feel left out.
Oh, darling, isn't mankind beautiful?
This has gone too far. All lives matter.
Also, are we going to pretend like we haven't noticed how the British press treated Meghan Markle? It's not a bug, it's a feature of this country. Black people in this country are not happy. Like in the US, there is a long and documented history of police brutality here, particularly against black people. Black people have been fighting for decades over here for equality and equity. There is a British history of civil rights movements too. To understand the disconnect between the perception of black people in the UK and the perception of white people regarding racism, we need to talk about blackness in the United Kingdom. We need to understand the difference between the conversation around racism in the United Kingdom with the one in the United States. Just like the US, the UK has a very heavy history of slavery, and both British and American societies have a tradition of being composed of separate communities. Therefore, the notion of those communities existing in their own space is not perceived in and of itself as a threat to the fabric of society in those countries, unlike in the other country that I will talk about later. Black communities in both the UK and the US have been allowed to coexist and strive to cater for their own needs. However, that facade of tolerance has been used to deny the fact that black communities do not receive equal treatment and do not have equal access to wealth, commodities and resource. But three main points set the UK apart from the situation of black Americans. First, the history of black people in the UK is more of a history of immigration rather than a history of oppression and exploitation on the land that they still live in today, like in America. Because most of black British can go back 2 or 3 generations to find their roots in what is now a different country, the black British identity is not as homogeneous as the African American identity, for instance, and that makes it perhaps more difficult for black British people to speak with one voice. Add to that the fact that black people are conveniently lumped together with other ethnic minorities, as shown by the widespread use of the term BAME, Black Asian Minority Ethnics, by the authorities, and it gives them a convenient excuse to avoid addressing the lack of black representation in the highest ranks of power, or specifically address anti-blackness. Listen to our Health Secretary Matt Hancock, quizzed after the murder of George Floyd.
How many black people are in the current cabinet?
There's a whole series of people from a black and minority ethnic background. the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, to name but two. So
I'm just talking about blacks.
Actually...
I'm talking about black people specifically, because I do think it's quite important not to lump everyone from non-white backgrounds together, because obviously Asian people, for example, face prejudice too, but it might be a different prejudice to that faced by black people. That's why I was specifically asking about how many black people there are in the current cabinet.
The two cabinets I've sat in with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister are the two most diverse cabinets I've ever sat in. And it's diversity of thought that's the really important thing when you're taking those big decisions around the cabinet table.
So actually, are you saying then that people from black backgrounds shouldn't really worry that there isn't a single person from a black background at the current cabinet table because you have diversity of thought?
What? As Ahmed Olayinkasule writes in The Guardian, the one-size-fits-all approach to tackling racism leaves undersupported the racial group which suffer the most brutality, hatred and discrimination. Furthermore, in white-dominant societies, blackness has come to be a synonym for crime, laziness, poverty and low intelligence. Now, there's a second reason why the conversation on racism is completely different in the UK and in the US. Although the conversation about race in the United Kingdom borrows a lot from the African American narrative and concepts, there are 40 million African Americans in the USA, and that's not even counting non-African American black people. Whereas in the UK, if you include mixed black people, there are about 2.5 million black people here. The sheer number of black people making up African American communities is big enough to allow for the emergence of a market for black people, which then drives a sense of black consciousness and unity. Whereas black communities in the UK have not been able to reach a certain critical mass that would grant them as much influence and soft power within the British society as their American counterparts. Finally, the third big difference is in the way both societies are socially divided. Traditionally, the British society is divided by class rather than by race. It's built upon centuries of class consciousness and class struggles that have shaped the identity of Britons. The majority of British people have no issue in identifying as working class or middle class, and they're proud of it, whereas the idea of identifying by race feels kind of alien. But the fact is, under capitalism, race and class have more or less the same function. The only difference is in how it is applied onto the individual. Both race and class are systems of hierarchy whereby the group at the top exploits and oppresses the groups that are at the bottom. And in both cases, you don't want to be at the bottom, but you also don't get to choose. Bummer. In both systems, the dominant group will justify its supremacy through an unequal system, preventing social mobility, rigged institutions, and violent policing. So, class and race are really two sides of the same coin, and it is not a coincidence if in both cases, black people find themselves at the bottom of the hierarchy. And this is why it is particularly perverse when, in the context of the United Kingdom, the notion of class and the examples of the white poor working class are used to obfuscate the conversation about anti-blackness. As Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it, capitalism requires inequality, and racism enshrines it. Because of their soft power and despite the extreme racism of American society, the American Black Lives Matter uprising has successfully managed to move forward the conversation about race in the US. Notions such as prison abolition and defunding the police, which were frankly fringe ideas only a few weeks ago, have now taken center stage. Back in the UK, the conversation about race is mostly set to the tune of American conversation. But the flip side of this is that while we're busy being appalled by how racist, corrupt and violent America is, we are looking away from our own issues of racism, violence and inequalities here on British soil. And we have much less resource and knowledge to narrate our British story. The other day was Juneteenth, and black British people were celebrating it, while it's not even a date that is relevant to the UK history. But nobody here knows what day we're supposed to commemorate the abolition of British slavery, so we're having to borrow the dates of the black Americans. Turns out it's the 23rd of August. I didn't know. As if the UK did not have its own history of slavery and abolition. So it's been very convenient for media and power to divert scrutiny to the US, acting like it's not an issue here. Because of the differences of context, demography and history, we cannot directly copy and paste the conversation around racism and anti-blackness from the United States. But the conversation here did not wait for the murder of George Floyd to expose institutional racism and bring the notion of systemic racism to the British public. In 1997, following the completely botched investigation by the British police into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence by a group of white youths, the Macpherson report laid bare the professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership that had marred the investigation. The Macpherson report was a landmark because it gave us for the first time an official definition of institutional racism. It is defined as the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. It is seen in processes, attitudes, and behavior which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantages minority ethnic people. And this alone is very important because anyone in the UK attempting to deny the existence of institutional racism, we can just go, look, it's here. It's written in an official report. We didn't make it up. In the recent years, more prominent black British voices have managed to catch the media attention and contributed to move the conversation about race forward in the country. To name a few, Kaale, rapper, journalist, activist, and author of the book Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of the Empire, which is one of the few books that specifically focuses on British racist history and how we are still living in it today. Afua Hirsch, she's a writer, journalist and broadcaster, and she has been an important voice advocating for the acknowledgement of colonial racism. She has been recently trending in the news with a video from 2018 where a suggestion to consider removing the statue of Winston Churchill prompted her racist co-host to ask her, why don't you leave this country if you hate it so much?
Afua, I really like you, but I wonder if I can remind you of some words you wrote concerning Britain.
Please do.
Britain. We have moved on from this era no more than the US from its slavery and segregationist past. The difference is that America is now in the midst of a frenzied debate on what to do about it, whereas Britain, in our inertia, arrogance and intellectual laziness, is not.
I don't write much bad, do I?
Well, you could have been a bit snappier, but I won't worry about subbing it. I'm delighted to... Why do you stay in this country? If you take such offence when you see Nelson's column, if you take such offence when you hear Winston Churchill's name, who I would argue, if in the unlikely event that anybody want to have a poll, I would say probably 80 to 90% of people would say that Winston Churchill did a good thing. I'm delighted that I see you at these Thursdays. I'm delighted you're up to sense. But if it offends you so much, how do you manage to stay here?
I find that a really strange thing to say. So there's nothing in Britain that bothers you?
Sure, but I don't want to pull it down.
So why is leaving an option?
But I don't want to
This
pull
is
it
my
down.
country. And the reason that I raise this critique is not because I hate Britain, it's because I care about this country.
So that happened. Did not age well, did it? Continuing. Monroe Bergdorf, she's a model and activist. She was the first trans woman to be the face of a global L'Oreal campaign in 2017, only to be dropped by L'Oreal a few days later because of a Facebook post where she had spoken out about white supremacy and racism. 3 years later, L'Oreal on Blackout Tuesday, in protest against racism after the murder of George Floyd, they posted on social media encouraging people to speak out against racism. The public and the media were quick to call out L'Oreal on their hypocrisy after they very publicly fired a model for doing exactly what they pretended to encourage now that it was commercially convenient for them. The new president of L'Oreal has since expressed regrets for the way the situation was handled by the company and has offered Monroe a consultancy role on their UK Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. Dave, the 22-year-old British rapper who shocked the British public with his performance of his song Black, talking about his experience of growing up as a black boy in this country and calling out the Prime Minister on his racist remarks. It was later revealed that the BBC received 257 complaints from the public, most of them claiming that Dave was racist for calling out racism and talking about his own experience. Rennie Edolodge is the author of the best-selling book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, that sheds a light on the violence that the white, respectable British society exerts on black people by trying to silence them or invalidate their experience of racism because of white fragility and refusal to acknowledge how all white people by default benefit from racism. So, even though the United Kingdom is rarely considered as the epicenter of racism in the world, it is the nation that birthed colonial racism, based on anti-blackness. And it is not a coincidence that this country was the first to take down a statue of a slave trader in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. It shows that there is a huge part of British history that is still an open wound within the society, and that absolutely needs to be tended to. George Floyd may have ignited a global explosion, but the oil has been building up in British society for decades. It's time to have this conversation. And yes, it's about race. In my next video, I'm going to be doing the English Defence League a favour by going back to where I came from. We will cross the English Channel to talk about France. I mean, not physically. I'm still going to be recording from this room. I'm going to show you how the French media responded to the takedown of the statue of Edward Colson in the UK, and what makes it so difficult in France to have an open conversation about race. Right, so I'm not really good at ending my videos, but this is not the end of the video because it's going to be a series. But it's the end of the video because you're going to have to click a button at some point or something. Otherwise, like, nothing happens. So thanks for watching till the end. If you skipped some parts, then that doesn't count. You have to go back and do it all over again. That's the rule. Like, subscribe, do anything you want, engage, like, do something. That's what it's for. I think that's how it works. Bye.